So this is a huge deal for me personally. I wrote for Cinemafantastique back from 1987 to 1982. It was during my stint in film school at Cal State Fullerton where I flunked out to write for Cinefantastique. So, and the reason being, listen, I'm not on any panels, so I'm just gonna intro this really quickly. Is when I went to college, I instantly discovered two things: that all my professors really should be running AA meetings instead of film school, and two, there was an enormous amount of snobbery that went into going to film school. So if you loved Star Wars, if you loved Universal Monsters, if you loved Paul Blaisdell, you were as big a freak in college as you were in high school. So in 1986, I got into a test screening of a movie called The Lost Boys that was produced by Richard Donner. And it was the first screening. It was a work print, and you would have thought it was the next Star Wars. The response was over the moon and completely insane. So if anybody remembers Fred Clark, he was all about the scoop. Everything was about the scoop. So since the movie was 9 months away, just on spec in college, I wrote an article on this movie that wasn't coming out for 9 months. A week later, I got a letter that changed my life. It literally changed my life. Fred Clark signed me up to write for the magazine, and I was in the company of Stephen Rebello, of Steve Rubin, Don Shea, Preston Neal Jones, the titans of genre journalism. I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. These guys really created an entire 50-year history that if anybody is here, if you went to a bookstore and saw one of these covers on the newsstand, it was Christmas Day. And you ran home and you read it cover to cover, and it just blew your mind. There was no Wikipedia, there was no internet, there was nothing. This was what formed my situation. So to have these guys here today is beyond extraordinary. Next year is our 25th anniversary, and this has to go down as my favorite event that I'm personally invested in. So, I want you guys to have a great time. Let's get rolling. There was only one guy who could host this panel because his history goes so far back with CFQ from so many different generations, including with Fred Clark. So he's the one who knows all these guys and can actually, ask the proper questions. So thank you for coming, seriously. Steve Bidrowski.
Thanks, Taylor.
Thanks everyone for being here. So, how is your sense of wonder? And you all know what I'm quoting, right? Very first issue, very first editorial Fred Clark ever wrote for Cinefantastique began with those words. How is your sense of wonder? That is what the magazine is about. We're going to talk a lot about what he achieved, behind the scenes dirt. We'll probably get into a little bit of that. We've all got our stories to tell. But as we're doing that, I don't want anyone to forget. Ultimately, that's what the magazine was about, a sense of wonder. As Taylor said, when Cinefantastique hit the stands, there was nowhere else really to learn about this stuff in that kind of depth. I mean, films didn't open nationwide, at least these kind of little low-budget horror films didn't. They kind of moved gradually through the country, stopping city to city, territory to territory. Maybe the local paper reviewed them. You didn't have a lot of ways of knowing what was approaching, what was out there that might come to your town. But Cinefantastique, it didn't have a big circulation, but it was national, and it wrote about these films in depth, and it took them seriously. It was like the cahier de cinema of science fiction. And very much, in his opening editorial, he was like, Cinefantastique, a very pretentious name for a monster movie magazine, isn't it? Well, that's fine, because we intend to cover the genre with all our pretensions intact. That's kind of what it was all about. It looked so good from the very beginning. It was a slick magazine. It looked like something that was professionally done. You're going to find out, if you don't know already, that it was basically pumped out of, the bedrooms of his mother's house for the first 13 years or thereabouts. And yet somehow he managed to make something that was wonderful. After the first issue came out, it expanded very quickly because people responded to it. People wrote him letters. People who read that first issue volunteered to write. For the first 7 years, nobody got paid a dime for it. It was like this amateur thing he did on the side, Fred Clark, while he was, doing his day job, selling laboratory supplies. But eventually it got big enough that he could start paying people and he could quit his day job and it became a full-time gig. So we're going to talk to some people here who were involved with it. It had a very long history, the magazine, from 1970 through about 2006 it published. They ceased publication then. I've been kind of keeping the website alive since then while the new owner figures out what he's going to do with it. So it kind of is sort of in limbo right now. It's not really dead, but it's in limbo, as I said. But because it has such a long history, we've got a lot of people, more people than will fit in the chairs here. We're going to hit it in decades. This is the 70s group up here now, then we're going to move on to the 80s, then the 90s and beyond. So we're going to start, we have some people here who have some nice stories to tell about those early days.
And by the way, we're not quite 70 yet, or are we?
We're not
I
70.
qualify. I thought he was talking about me.
Some of us
So-
are definitely 70s.
Jeffrey Frenson is one of the people who was there from the earliest days. He was there at Ground Zero. You wrote a few freelance pieces for him, but you were the first person who actually entered Fred's inner sanctorum and worked with him. So maybe you could begin, and I'll get to all of you. I'll introduce you as I ask you your first question. But tell us what it was like working with him and pumping that magazine out and trying to meet deadlines and not meeting them. What was it like there? Because it was not the most conducive situation towards doing a professional-looking magazine, which it was.
Up to the point where I was hired, he was on his own. He was pushing this magazine out. He was using an IBM Selector typewriter with kerning potentials and made it look very professional. I want to point out, though, that the first issues of CFQ were actually mimeographed issues that were published in the late 60s, I think, 67 and going forward.
Oh, yeah, that's why this is
One on the wall right there.
that's why we're doing the 50th anniversary this year, even though issue 1 of Cinefantastique officially came out in 1970. Those mimeograph newsletters were going from 67, so that's how we're dating the 50th anniversary.
Wow.
I had just been out of university, and I'd been writing for CFQ since volume 3 or 4, and just writing reviews. And he liked my reviews, and I think he liked florid, descriptive critiques that sometimes went way over the top. And I was one of those people. I enjoyed writing that. I looked around at other magazines at the time, like Photon, and Randall Larson had a fanzine and so forth, and thought that CFQ was definitely the high point of the era of this zine genre. Anyway, he invited me to come and visit him in Oak Park. I met his mother. I met her cats. She had 2 beautiful Siamese cats that were just, they could barely see. And she didn't, Olive, his mom, didn't really understand what the magazine was all about, but she was always very pleasant for the most part. And I worked in his home on Lombard Street in Oak Park. It was on the 2nd floor. I'd get to work and he would be cutting out pieces of variety, weekly variety on the toilet. And say, just get to work, will ya? One of the reasons I was hired is because we were upgrading to actual typesetting unit, and I had some experience with that unit. And I was simply looking for a way to get into a magazine job. I had just gotten out of school, and I loved Fred's magazine. It was, to me, that was like a unique venture. Nothing like that had come out. Of course, it's been imitated many, many times, that style. Working with Fred was very straightforward. We did nothing but watch movies. I mean, we'd go out almost every night to some movie, because in those days, in the late 70s, Chicago was a great movie town, and they had great repertory, and you could see triple bills of almost anything you wanted there. Let's see, it was a heads down kind of operation. We just cranked out the issues. I was involved in editing and did very little in the way of graphic design or page layout. I was mostly hired as an editor and a writer, and came to enjoy working for CFQ. I tend to forget about the reasons why I left. But what it came down to is that I had kind of outgrown the office environment there. I had outgrown the pay scale, and realized that I could go further in another venue. And Fred tried to keep me on, but I was really ready to go. We also hired while I was there I guess like an assistant editor, and his name is David Scow. And David came to work with us in Chicago, and he and I became very good friends, and we ended up writing a book together. Actually worked on a couple of different books. And that also was one of the reasons why someone might leave CFQ to go to greener pastures, because we got a book deal. And we simply moved on, both of us. Anyway, I had a good time there. I loved watching the movies. We'd go down to his friend Greg Ferret's house and watch Japanese monster movies, and Fred and Greg would sit there complaining to each other about how terrible or good these movies are. And so Fred had interesting friendships with people. He was a peculiar fellow to me. I'd never really seen anybody put up with so much to get this magazine out. It was a labor of love beyond belief. He did also kind of publishing tricks, around the double issues, because he really wanted stories such as Steve's Forbidden Planet story and a few others to really be the last word on the subject. And so he would go the extra distance. Sometimes it was at cross purposes, but he would go the distance and make it the best he could.
That was what Fred was about, making it the best he could. The early issues of Cinefantastique, if you see them, are very review-oriented, because at that point he didn't have the inroads to Hollywood and filmmaking. But it's all about reviews. It's all about how much people love the movies. And then as time went on and he got more professional writers, people who had other outlets they wrote for and had access, he got into what Jeff is talking about. Let's do Star Wars better than anybody. Flash the Star Wars double issue. That really got Cinefantastique to the next level. They took, there were ads taken out. It was something you saw, even if you'd never heard of the magazine before. For a lot of us, that was our entry level.
It was a very controversial production too, this issue, because of his relationship with the major studios were evolving, let's say.
Well, basically, Fox threatened to sue him over that issue. They said it wasn't a magazine, it was a piece of merchandising, and they tried to keep it off the stands, and they sent him a lot of letters about, you can't use these photos because they're only for what they call promotional purposes. They don't define that really clearly, but for some reason they decided this was not an issue of a magazine. It was a merchandising tie-in. And one of the people involved there at the time, has claimed, well, you can tell it's not a real issue of the magazine because it's Star Wars from cover to cover, which is not true. Don Shea, well, actually, no, you did the later CE3K coverage. It's an issue. It's got reviews. It's got coverage of Close Encounters. It's got The Fury, which was written by Sam Irvin, which is as good a transition as any to get over to Sam here. Sam is one of those people. You had one of those fanzines we briefly mentioned, right? So, there weren't a lot of professional magazines at this time. There were fanzines, and you told me that Fred took out an ad in Bazaar?
Yeah, I mean, Cinefantastique for me, as any of the older people in this crowd will share the same thing. I mean, we grew up with Famous Monsters, and Castle of Frankenstein was, of course, the more serious version of that. But when Cinefantastique came out in 1970, it was just the Rolls Royce of genre coverage. I mean, it was just unbelievable. And it inspired an entire generation of people like myself and Richard Clemenson with Little Shop of Horrors and a million other fanzines. And I started in '72, I started my own fanzine called Bazaar. Here's one with Frankenstein, the True Story on the cover. And then Fred he wrote me these incredibly kind letters that were incredibly supportive, which he didn't need to do, but he was very supportive of the magazine. And I was like, why is he doing this? It's like, he doesn't need me. His magazine is the
gold standard.
The gold standard, absolutely. But then in my fourth issue, he bought, I still think it's ridiculous, he bought a 2-page ad for Cinefantastique in my little fanzine. So I'm like, and for me, it was like, he doesn't, there's nobody who reads my magazine who isn't already getting Cinefantastique. So he was total charity. But it raised the level of my magazine to be able to say, oh, well, one of our advertisers is Cinefantastique. So, it was pretty amazing. But when I stopped doing the magazine after this issue because I was really serious about getting into film production as a director was my goal. And I started stalking, I guess you could say, Brian De Palma. And I ended up, I went to film school at University of South Carolina. I got De Palma to come out there for a film festival that I organized. He was casting Carrie at the time. I called up the casting department that I had found their number in Hollywood Reporter, and they said, oh, he'll be on a break in 10 minutes, call back in 10 minutes. They put him right on the phone. I was like, what? And it was this famous casting session where he and George Lucas were reading Every Kid in Town for Star Wars and Carrie, and I convinced him to come out to South Carolina. So that's how I met him, and that was when I was in college. So then between my junior and senior year, by then Carrie had come out, huge hit, but he had gotten The Fury going at 20th Century Fox, which was his first really big budget film. And so I called him up and I said, in my summer break between my junior and senior year, can I please come up to Chicago and work on the film as a production assistant or anything? And he said, sure, come on up. So my next call was to Fred. And I said, Fred, I'm coming to your neighborhood, first of all, but secondly, I'm gonna be on the set every day of The Fury. Can I get an assignment to write a journal on the making of the film? And Fred immediately said, absolutely, this is so cool. We'll do a whole cover story like we did on Carrie, and it's gonna be great. So then by the time I arrived there, now I have the cachet where I'm not just a lowly gopher, I'm also can be introduced as the guy who has an assignment to do a cover story on Cinemafantastique. And De Palma had loved the issue they did on Carrie, and he read the magazine, and other people working on the crew knew it. Certainly, especially in the makeup department, William Tuttle and people like that. They knew the magazine very well. So I suddenly, my stock was way higher because of Cinefantastique, and it allowed me to have one-on-one interviews with Kirk Douglas and John Cassavetes and all these incredible legends. And then when they were editing the film, I went up to New York during my Christmas break and got to meet Paul Hirsch, the editor of Star Wars, just incredible stuff to flesh out that. Okay, so I have interviewed Amy Irving, got the first scoop of her admitting to having a relationship with Steven Spielberg. Fred loved that. He was like, "Oh my God, we're gonna put this in," and he put it.
The Star Wars issue.
He put that in the Star Wars issue, and that was very exciting. And everything was going fantastically until the movie came out, The Fury, and Fred saw it and hated it. So. The cover story got canceled. The whole journal he edited way down to a few pages. It was still a nice spread, but it was intended to be many times longer. And the issue ended up becoming the Hans J. Salter issue,
Right.
which I
So,
understand
Preston,
you were
Neil
in charge
Jones
of.
replaced Sam Riley's cover story. Yes.
So
Can I interrupt just for a second?
Yes.
I said earlier how for the first few years there was no payment at all, and eventually Fred started paying a few pennies per word, and you wonder why were people working for Cinefantastique for no pay? Well, you see, it had cachet. You got to meet your idols. You got to meet the people whose films you loved and admired. Suddenly you were getting one-on-one interviews with them. It was a really big deal.
The other thing
Huge
worth
deal.
mentioning is that he did start paying staff.
Eventually, yeah.
Like when I
Yeah.
was hired, he was paying me $13,000 a year. So he did attempt, and I know he did later with Elaine and
So
some of
we
the other.
probably made more than all the freelance writers for the first 10 years of the magazine. So anyway, so yes, that was more or less the end of your tenure, because at that point you were kind of in the industry and you felt conflict of interest.
I did. I mean, I had to be the one to go tell De Palma that that cover story that I was promising you is not happening, and I thought for sure he was gonna be really upset. I couldn't have cared less, and I ended up being his assistant for several years after that. But after that, it felt odd. It felt like a conflict of interest when I was working in the industry to also be writing about it, and so I kind of shied away from it after that. It was a tricky experience. but.
Definitely. I realize now we have you in the wrong order, because really I should now jump to Preston Neal Jones, who did the Hans J. Salter issue,
Yes.
which came after Star Wars and before the Close Encounters
Yeah.
issue. So it was odd, because in the editorial for that issue, Fred says something like, "You're probably wondering why we're doing this cover story on this guy who wrote music for 1940s horror films right in the middle of the big science fiction boom." And he said it's because the big science fiction boom is going nowhere fast. Fred famously kind of trashed Star Wars, not in a review, but in his editorials. He thought the effects were great, but it had no sense of wonder. You know, it wasn't imaginative or challenging. And he felt similarly about Close Encounters. Great looking effects, but you know, it's just a bunch of cute aliens bopping around so people can, you know, stare slack-jawed at them. He had nothing good to say about that.
Oh,
so
that crazy Fred.
So he went with Hans J. Salter, 1940s Universal horror movies like The Wolf Man. So tell us about working with Fred and working on that retro.
Could I? I brought a little show and tell, and it has actual liquid in it because my throat is getting very dry. Can you all hear me okay? If I hold the microphone here, thank you. This is, I will have you know, a rarity. It is a Cinefantastique mug.
Whoa.
And there's a picture of Gort the robot from the day the Earth stood still. There's a Cinefantastique logo exactly as it appears over my head and on these magazines. And oh, thank you. And it says Cinefantastique, the magazine with a sense of wonder. So I'm toasting Fred's memory, and I toast all of you folks for showing up today. In my case, the interview came before the prestige of being in Cinefantastique. I grew up loving the music of Hans Salter and Frank Skinner for the original Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi, Frankenstein, Dracula, Wolfman, Mummy movies. I got to know him, I got to interview him, and I wrote to Fred Clark, because like everybody else, I loved the magazine, and told him what I was working on and would he be interested in doing something with it. And he wrote back immediately. He said, "You happen to be talking to a Hans J. Salter fan." So we were off to the races, and he made not only a cover story, but here's the actual artifact. He made it into a wraparound cover story.
Beautiful piece
So
of artwork.
there you can see over there the front cover that you see on the newsstand, and you get it home and discover that you have this objet d'art by a wonderful guy named Roger Stein, who also ended up doing a cover for, and I'll get to this later, there's something I was doing for Fred about Star Trek the Motion Picture, but that's another painting right there, my billboard, that's my book cover. Available wherever better books are sold, especially here where it was published, read your features. The beautiful thing about the Salter issue, or the most beautiful thing, was the fact that it began a Salter renaissance. He was a very obscure figure and filmdom, and he, unlike a lot of other fine Hollywood composers, he'd never had a soundtrack album released of any of his scores. The way John Morgan, an orchestrator and record producer, has put it, he was an A composer for B movies, and this really put him closer to being on the map than he had been before. And to spare a long story, it led inevitably to the first Hans J. Salter record album, and that one was based on tracks that he had already recorded for a television series called Maya. And then there were other albums made from tracks that he had already recorded. And then finally, John Morgan, who I just mentioned, orchestrated The Ghost of Frankenstein and House of Frankenstein for a classical musical company, Marco Polo. And that album came out and was a big hit, and that led to a couple of dozen other classic movie albums on Marco Polo with brand new recordings with the symphony orchestra. In any event, it did my heart good when Hans had his signing for that first CD to see that there was a line around the block at the bookstore where this was being held. So I'll always be grateful to Fred for that. Now, I don't want to jump ahead on the tail end of the 70s chronology. 'cause
Right,
that's
we'll,
where
we'll
we
get to
started.
that other story.
Except it's all off
There's
for
many
now.
stories with Cinefantastique that we should call the ones that got away, the cover stories that were promised or developed that never happened. And you have one, and you already mentioned one that kind of sort of got there. So yeah, we'll get to that in a second. But continuing chronologically, so we went from Star Wars, there was the Salter issue, then the Close Encounters issue, which was another double issue, went into incredible detail. It was like reading, a book, just not in hardcover, that told you everything you could possibly want to know about how that film got made. Because at the time, as good as the effects in Star Wars were, they were in outer space, kind of this unreal world. And this took place on Earth, and yet you believed the flying saucers were there. And that was quite a technical achievement, and there was a lot to say about that.
There was. Actually, I think Steve was involved in CFQ before I was, but as long as you're.
Yeah,
running down
I'm
the line.
sorry, we're going to get to you, yeah.
If there's any time, we'll get to you, Steve.
There will always be time for Steve Rubin.
Well, just to back up a little bit from Close Encounters, I think I probably discovered Cinefantastique probably around third or fourth issue. I don't know. I remember it was Larry Edmonds' bookshop, and because you didn't find it in Barnes and Noble back then.
Right.
So, like Sam, I had published a little magazine in college called Kaleidoscope, which was a film magazine. A fanzine, I guess you would call it, although I always hated that word. And it was a little bit broader than just science fiction, fantasy, and horror. We had interviews with, major actors and stuff. So, and I always loved the magazine, doing magazines. Then I got away from it, and I had published, or I had written a long thing on Willis O'Brien that was published in a British magazine called Focus on Film. So somewhere after I discovered the magazine, went back and bought the few back issues I was missing, and certainly kept up with it. I don't even remember making contact with Fred, but obviously it must have come from my end rather than his. So I basically offered my services, and since I could write and he wasn't paying anybody anyway, he was willing to give you a shot here. So actually the first thing I did for him was a piece on A Boy and His Dog, which was, for those of you who remember that one, movie written and directed by L.Q. Jones, whom I knew because I was doing a project on, say, a Pecapod at the time. And so I did a long interview with him and a long interview with Harlan Ellison and put together this piece on the making of A Boy and His Dog, which Fred seemed to like, and so I did another one for him on The Omen, where I talked to Gregory Peck and Richard Donner. So that, and then I kind of started writing little things. If he needed filler stuff, I would write things for him if he needed it. And I, sooner or later found my name on the masthead as the Hollywood correspondent.
Nice title.
Yeah. So anyway, when Close Encounters came along, the Star Wars issue had appeared, I think, a couple issues before that one, and I presumably offered to do it because I knew Doug Trumbull fairly well at that point. I had interviewed him a number of times on other projects. And what Fred had done a number of times, it was also in the Star Wars issue, is he would run a whole bunch of interviews. Like the Star Wars issue, I believe, had interviews by about 5 or 6 different people. But he ran them in kind of discrete segments. So you had the interview with Dennis Muren, and then you'd have the interview with Carrie Fisher, and then it was there was nothing particularly cohesive about it. So what I thought I would do with the Close Encounters thing is I went out and interviewed about 20 people for that thing, and rather than doing them as discrete interviews, I decided to piece them all together. So they kind of came out looking like a movie script in a sense, because you'd have a 3-paragraph quote by Dennis Muren, and then you go to a 3-paragraph quote by somebody else. And then where it needed, I would kind of fill in with some text of my own. So it almost came out looking like this kind of weird movie script with people that talked for a long time. And I kind of broke the thing into 3 sections. I did an article on the, one section on the creatures, where I interviewed all the guys who were involved in the creatures. And then I had a very long interview with Steven Spielberg. Probably the longest I ever had with him. It was over an hour, back when he wasn't quite the Steven Spielberg he is now. And so we talked for a long time, and I think I did that up as a Q&A, and so that was the second one. But then the longest section was strictly on the visual effects, which were being done by Doug Trumbull and his company, Future General, at the time. And I interviewed just about everybody on staff, I think, for that one, and spent a long time. And it seemed like a logical way to put together, but it was kind of an arduous process, because I was trying to have it tell a story. It wasn't just, we just kind of started out and developing the movie, and it just kind of worked all the way through the production, jumping back and forth from speaker to speaker, and who might get repeated 20 times during the different sections of different speakers would flow throughout the article. And so in the end of it, it was kind of a chronological story on the making of the visual effects of the movie. So that was kind of it, and it was long. I remember how long it was, because I don't know whether I was the first writer Fred paid, but it was the first time he paid me. I turned in 40,000 words of manuscript on Close Encounters, which is pretty close to book length. And I got the princely sum of $800 for it. And so that was like 2 cents a word. And I promptly went out, this was 1977, and I promptly went out, Sony had just come out with their Betamax a few months before that. I went out and bought the first Betamax.
Nice.
All right.
And as far as I'm concerned, it's still better than VHS.
VHS. All right. So yeah, it was around that time, or maybe just before, that Fred had quit his day job because he was making enough money off the magazine, and obviously, if he didn't need the day job, that meant he could afford to pay at least a couple cents a word to the writer.
So I credited Fred with getting my first VCR.
So you should have consulted Steve Rubin. He'd been doing this synthesizing of interviews into story length, cover stories for a while there.
Well, yeah, but he actually molded them into, mine would just looked different. It was the same thing, all his retrospectives. I told him a little while ago, and I'll repeat it publicly. I think Steve, the work that Steve did for Fred was the best stuff that was ever published in the magazine. I thought those retrospectives he did from those 1950s classics were brilliant, and I wish somebody had put them in a book.
They had a huge impact on people, yeah, they did.
Very nice.
I'll tell you how big that impact is of those retros, is if you talk to people now and they're talking about the glory days or when they really love Cinefantastique, they'll say, I love it when they did those retrospectives in the early days. And if you look like at the first 10 years of Cinefantastique, there's about 3 or maybe 4 cover stories that are retrospectives on old films. But that's what people remember. It's like Day the Earth Stood Still and War of the Worlds, which is up there, and then Forbidden Planet. That has kind of erased people's memories that, most of the covers at that time were whatever the new film was out, but that's what people remember. That's what made the impression. So you were dubbed by Fred the film archaeologist, because you were writing retros that weren't just recycling stuff we already knew. So tell us how you came into Cinefantastique. You found it, I think, an issue in Larry Edmunds as well,
Yeah,
right?
Don and I shared that. I used to ride my bike up to Hollywood and buy film stills. I had no friends who were into this at all. I was like an island, and I was a history major at UCLA, and I found that first issue. I think it was the second issue, the first part of the George Pal issue. And I was writing my first book. I came out of UCLA with no idea what I wanted to do, but I wanted to write something, and I was very much interested in World War II movies. I had seen all of them, and my dad was always watching a World War II movie, and in those days, before all of the craziness of Hollywood got too crazy, you just open your phone book and you'd find a screenwriter and you'd call him. And it was just, there was no, by the way, there was no reference book that had all the credits. In fact, I think actually the Academy had one book, but there was no reference book, so you had to constantly find out what these people did. So I was interviewing a screenwriter named Ted Sherman. He wrote a movie called Hell to Eternity. It was a classic World War II movie about Jeffrey Hunter was a guy growing up in LA. He was raised by Japanese Americans, and he eventually goes into the Marines. So we're sitting there at the end of the interview, and he says, it kind of reminds me of what I did on Them. And talk about a lightning striking you at that moment, because when I used to go to the Stadium Theater on Pico. I lived across the street from a movie theater for 6 years, and every Saturday morning, like a lot of us, I'd go see those double features. And Them, with those big ants in the desert, had a huge impact on me. I think my father, our main trip every year was to go to Vegas for Memorial Day. And I'd see that desert every year, and I'd think of those ants. So I picked up that second issue, and I said, you know, maybe Fred Clark, the editor of this magazine, might be interested in an interview with Sherman. So I got a really cool letter from Fred, and Fred was very good at making an initial connection. And he asked me if I write reviews. I mean, I knew nothing about this world at all, but I said I might be able to get to the director. And so I interviewed Gordon Douglas and Ted Sherman. And what was very cool about this process is I went over to Warner Brothers, and I asked, you know, I was a total neophyte. I didn't know how you find photos but I asked them if they had any behind-the-scenes stills. And they opened up their key book for me. I guess I got them on the right day. And they gave me 3 behind-the-scenes shots of them. And no one had ever seen a making of shot of that movie. And the reaction was very cool. There were Fred was very cool. I just turned in 2 interviews. I did not write the retrospective at that moment. I give credit for Fred putting it together. But I told him that my very favorite movie was, well, there were 2, Forbidden Planet and Day the Earth Stood Still. And I started to do interviews, and I found people who hadn't spoken before. And it culminated, I would say, on the Day the Earth Stood Still. I went over to Fox, and I was talking to somebody in the art department, and they said, you want to see some pictures from the movies? So he takes me out to this old warehouse, and there's filing cabinet after filing cabinet, and he opens up this filing drawer and hands me the key book of the Day the Earth Stood Still, with every set still. And on one of those pages was Lock Martin inside the Gord suit with the visor up so you can see his face. And I said, oh my God, they're going to go nuts over this. And this is typical Fred. He said, here, just take this and get it back to me. You know what? I'm walking out of 20th Century Fox with the key book, which was like Howard Carter coming out of the tomb of Tutankhamun. So I raced to a telephone booth in those days, you know, before electronics. I immediately called Fred and said, Fred, I found this. Saying, yeah, all right, get some pictures of me, it's fine. He was totally unimpressed. But this issue, he really blew out the stops, and we got a lot of room in the magazine, and we found every possible shot you could. And this cover became, as Preston says, it became part of collectibles. You put it on mugs and T-shirts and sweatshirts. And Leonard Maltin wrote me a fan letter. I mean, it's a big deal for a new writer. And I had done the Forbidden Planet retrospective. That was kind of fun because I got to meet Bill Malone. They say if you're going to do a Forbidden Planet retrospective, you've got to go see Bill. Bill, for those of you who don't know, owned Robbie the Robot until last week when he sold him for $4.3 million.
Whoa.
Unbelievable story there. But and then after Day the Earth Stood Still, I had a wonderful time doing the War of the Worlds retrospective and got very friendly with George Pal. And what happened was I was prepping. I had interviewed David Duncan for a retrospective on the Time Machine, and we were starting to prep that. And then I got a job. I actually got a Hollywood job. I was selling the magazines. I don't remember if I got the page rate, but Fred would give me all the magazines. And I would go to, let's see, the first one I went to was Equicon in '76 down at the airport. And I laid out a table with all the CFQs, just like you have here. And no one had ever seen that before in LA. So they were selling like hotcakes. And that's why Fred and I would split the profits. So I would make a few bucks. And I remember that very specifically. It was the spring of '76, and a blonde-haired guy came over, and he wrote on one of the magazines, he wrote, "May the force be with you." I remember this is spring '76, a full year before the film. He says, "You'll remember that," and that was Mark Hamill. Wow. It was very cool. But I got a job. Because of CFQ, it was my entry into the business. Phil Kaufman hired me to do exactly what George Lucas had done with Star Wars. He had hired Charlie Lippincott to go to all the conventions and promote Star Wars a year before the film opened. Well, I was hired by Phil Kaufman to do the same thing for Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the Leonard Nimoy, Donald Sutherland remake. And that was the beginning of my career. I spent 25 years as a film publicist, and just I made my producing debut in 2002. I made a film for Showtime called Bleacher Bums, not genre related, but I've been writing and producing ever since. And still writing, of course. My latest book is the Twilight Zone Encyclopedia, which just came out.
can probably buy copies of that here, right, Taylor?
Absolutely.
All right, cool. So we're going to get on to the 80s panel in a minute, but before we do, I've mentioned briefly this one that got away situation. There's at least, I don't know if everyone has a one that got away. You have The Outer Limits, you had Star Trek, and kind of The Time Machine you never finished, but that was just not finished.
I
Right?
gave him one retro, which for some reason he didn't publish. I did a retro on The Invisible Boy, which was a cool little Forbidden Planet semi-sequel, but I still have it. In fact, if you do bring the magazine back, Steve, I'm available.
Okay, sure thing. You sure that didn't end up as like a co-feature in the Forbidden Planet issue? He published something somewhere about that film. I can't remember. So let's talk about Outer Limits and why it didn't happen. So you'd been bugging Fred for like an actual writer's contract with deadlines and things, which isn't how Fred worked. Fred once told me, and this is years after you were there, as far as Fred was concerned, everything he'd done for him was on spec. You know, even if he said, yeah, I want to see it, I want to read, you know, you wrote it, you sent it to him. If he used it and it got in the magazine, you got paid for what he put into the magazine. And if it was cut in half, well, you didn't get paid for the stuff that wasn't used. So actually trying to get him to behave like a professional publisher.
It was not possible. But in our case, I was working with David Scow on doing a retrospective on The Outer Limits, and during the course of researching that, Fred was very generous with his time. He got us 16 millimeter prints to look at. He was really into it, but in the course of putting the research together, we realized that he didn't like The Outer Limits.
He was quirky. Yeah.
And he liked Star Trek. And thought Star Trek was or Outer Limits was a bastard child of Star Trek, when actually the opposite was the case. Anyhow, Scow went ahead and got a contract with Twilight Zone magazine, and we serialized the articles there. And I went to Fred and said, "You going to meet this?" No way. So I moved on, and David moved on, and The Outer Limits got published elsewhere.
And eventually it became a book, and
A series of books.
right, a series. And Preston, you have a similar kind of situation. Yours, unlike Outer Limits, was actually announced. It was like coming next issue. It was going to be the Star Trek, the motion picture, double issue, just like Star Wars and Close Encounters had got. And you wrote it, but it never happened.
Well,
As a magazine.
as you say, he was quirky.
Yeah.
One of the quirks that I was warned about when I did the very first issue for him, the Salter piece, was that he could occasionally play fast and loose with your manuscript. So I made a point of writing down on every page can only be changed with the written permission of the author. And so he did a wonderful job. I was happy with the piece. Hans Salter was happy. Fred was happy. And I didn't do much, if anything, with Cinefantastique for a while. That was 1978 that was printed. And then in 1979, I got a call from Fred. And he said, we did the special issues on Star Wars and Close Encounters. How would you like to do one on the Star Trek movie they're working on? And I thought to myself, I can talk to Robert Wise. I can talk to Jerry Goldsmith. I can talk to Isaac Asimov. I said, yeah, sure. So I went about my business, and they were still in post-production, working on effects at that time. And so it was, the actors were very easy to get to. They weren't occupied at the moment. And he had the help of the Paramount Publicity Department of feeding me people to interview. And Fred did love his Star Trek. So he got more excited every time I sent him a new interview. And he kept saying, more people, more people, more people. So I ended up interviewing 60 people. And
Wow.
taking forever to write the piece. It was more than a book-like piece when it was finally written. But Fred was tearing his hair out, waiting for a final manuscript. And then when I finally did send it to him, it was my turn to tear my hair out, because he was announcing it. He used it as a way to sell subscriptions to the magazine. This year we're going to have this special Star Trek issue. He paid me an advance for having handed it over to him. But in the event, and I'll still never know why, he was making noises for years and years that he was finally going to publish the Star Trek thing, and he never did, for reasons known but to Fred and God. And that's where I'll put a bookmark in until the last panel, when I'll tell the rest of my story with Fred.
Question?
I was going to mention something about how CFQ gave us opportunities we would have never had in the real world. I mean, the late Kyle Counts, a wonderful writer who was putting together a retrospective on the Birds. He calls me up one day and says, "Steve, I can't come down. Can you interview Hitchcock?" I said, "What?" So I actually went over to Universal shortly before Hitchcock passed, and I sat in a room with Alfred Hitchcock for an hour. How about that?
Good for you.
Okay.
All right, so I want to give the 80s people from Cinemafantastique a chance to talk. Thank you for your contribution so far. Thanks for making those first 10 years so good that these other people wanted to come on board and start working for the magazine.